Alright, so you've been learning Japanese, you've watched every Learn Japanese video on YouTube, you've listened to Learn Japanese while you sleep every night, and you've told your family members to start saying kun after your name. You've even started eating pizza with chopsticks, and you're starting to think, maybe I should try to speak some of this Japanese thing. Watashi wa konnichiwa desu. Genki desu ka?
Stop! You violated the law!
Is this you? Well, fear not, because today we're going to talk about why you suck at Japanese and what you need to do to fix it. Now, you've probably seen countless different pieces of advice out there on learning how to speak a foreign language. Speak from day one, use an AI chatbot, use the grammar you just learned, talk to your dog in Japanese. Yeah, so I'm here to tell you that you're trying too hard. Have you ever noticed that when people talk about foreign languages, they always ask, do you speak X language, and not, do you understand X language? For some reason, we put a ton of emphasis on speaking ability specifically and never really pay attention to comprehension ability in regard to foreign languages. It's almost like a lot of people have this idea that specifically speaking a language is the end-all be-all of language learning. This makes sense as to why so many people seem to think that speaking is the key to becoming fluent in a foreign language. You see this sort of advice everywhere, so much to the point that if you ask people who don't know a single thing about language learning, they're just gonna say, oh yeah, speak the language as much as possible to learn it, just use what you know, etc., stuff like that. And I'm here to tell you that this is pretty bad advice actually.
But wait a minute, you can't just say speaking to improve your language ability is a bad idea. That's insane. What are you even talking about?
Yeah, you're right, and that's actually not what I'm saying. So before I elaborate more on what I mean, let's take a step back. If you've seen my channel, you know that all I do is yap about input this, listen for thousands of hours that, don't use a textbook, blah blah blah. Yeah, okay, we get it. You're not gonna learn Japanese if you don't spend an immense amount of time taking in natural language, and there's no way around that. That's the entire point of the videos that I make. Now, why is this important for speaking ability? Well, it's because if you want to attain actual fluency in a language, especially one that's not even slightly related to your native language, memorizing conjugations and trying to build sentences in your head is only going to get you so far. That is, unless you're just treating it like a party trick to impress some people on the street or something. This is called the skill building approach. Think YouTube polyglots who shock natives in 754 different languages. And if your goal is to build real, authentic competence in speaking that comes out naturally, you're going to want to avoid using this as much as possible. If you don't internalize Japanese to the point in which you don't have to think about whether what's coming out of your mouth is correct or not, you're going to be stuck doing this forever, and ultimately your speaking ability isn't going to improve much past a very basic level. Speaking is not the means to acquire knowledge and competence, but rather a product of utilizing knowledge and competence that you've already acquired. So what does this actually mean? Well, it means that in order to produce natural speech, you need an up-to-date model of natural language that's already built up inside of your head. So how do you actually build that model? By getting input. Basically just listening to and reading so much Japanese to the point in which you're intuitively able to know what sounds right and what sounds wrong. To make this easier to understand, let's think of language learning as an apple tree, or an orange tree, or a banana tree, or literally any tree that grows fruit. The ultimate goal of learning a language for most people is to become able to speak naturally without feeling severely limited by lack of ability. The goal of an apple tree is to produce apples. We can think of this as output ability. When you first plant an apple tree, there are no apples, or even a tree yet. You can try to take apples from the tree if you want, but you're going to be disappointed because there's no apples. Similarly, you can try to speak Japanese from a very early point, but the tree in your head, or mental framework of the language, is not fully developed yet, so anything that comes out is going to be very broken and unnatural. In order to harvest the apples, you first need to give the tree water and exposure to sunlight over a long period of time, allowing it to grow a trunk, branches, leaves, etc. You can think of getting input as the water and sunlight to your language model, which are the core elements that are going to grow your understanding of Japanese and give you an accurate framework to work with. Once the tree is fully grown, the apples are going to grow naturally, similar to how if you get enough input, your intuitive understanding of Japanese is going to be so strong that output's mostly going to come naturally to you. So basically, I'm just saying that your speaking ability is limited by and strengthened by your ability to understand things. So now you're thinking, wait a minute, hold on, that's it? Just input and forget about practicing your speaking ability? Yeah, you've kind of lost it. I think I'm going to have to leave a dislike and a hate comment and then leave. No, that's actually not what I'm saying. Hold on, let me cook. The bulk of how well you're going to be able to output relies mostly on how strong your mental model of Japanese is, but it's not the entire picture. You still need to practice speaking to get good at speaking. You can sort of think of practicing speaking as the icing on the cake and your foundation and input as the cake itself. Despite output ability being limited by input ability, you're still not going to reach your peak potential just by inputting forever. At some point, you're going to need to spend a lot of time speaking in order to build up comfort and accuracy in expressing what you want to say. So you're probably wondering, Okay, so you're saying I need to wait until my mental model of Japanese is at a strong level in order to begin practicing my speech. Isn't that gonna take thousands of hours and years of waiting? Well, yeah, it actually takes a really long time to fully develop your mental model of Japanese, but whether or not you want to wait that long to start speaking is really up to you, and I'll discuss that in a second. There are so many different opinions out there about when the right time to start trying to speak is, but the main takeaway that I want to leave you guys with is that if you understand that the majority of your ability is going to come from getting input, you're going to be fine. If you're in a situation where you're speaking Japanese as part of your daily life, you live in Japan, you have Japanese friends that you talk to, etc., don't go burdening your real life for the sake of min-maxing your language learning. People have different goals in mind when it comes to learning Japanese. Some people want to just have a good time hanging out with natives and they don't really care if they make mistakes, and other people want to literally become Japanese. Your end goal doesn't really matter, but you are probably going to want to take a different approach depending on what end goal you do have. I see a tendency in immersion learning communities to vilify what's called early output, and even though I largely agree with the reasons for why speaking early isn't always optimal, I don't think it's nearly as bad as some people make it out to be, and to be honest, I think a lot of people wait way too long. You're not forever dooming your output ability by speaking early. As long as you get lots of input and try to mimic how native speakers talk, you're gonna sound pretty good. That being said, if you really care about sounding natural and you want to take the path of least resistance getting there, it's definitely going to be worth putting some upfront effort into building your understanding and perception ability before you try to produce the language yourself. If you start speaking Japanese without a strong model of how Japanese actually works, you're just setting yourself up to say very unnatural things and taking the chance that you solidify flaws in your own speech that you're not able to perceive yet. The biggest risk that you're taking in this is probably your accent. If you care about avoiding this, then you're probably going to want to take what's called a silent period, which is essentially just spending a period of time getting mass input before you start trying to speak for yourself. The rest of the advice that I'm going to give here is with this goal in mind, but feel free to apply it as you see fit. So why is the silent period actually useful? Well, I've talked about him on my channel in the past, but the originator of this idea is the linguist Stephen Krashen, and he's the originator of the input hypothesis. Basically, he's just the guy who came up with most of the principles that I talk about on my channel in regard to learning languages with input. So Krashen actually wrote a book about second language acquisition, and in that book he says that during a silent period, someone is building up competence in the second language via listening by understanding the language around them, and that in accordance with the input hypothesis, speaking ability is going to emerge on its own after enough competence has been developed by listening and understanding. He says that adults and children in formal language classes are usually not allowed a silent period, and that they're often asked to produce language at a very early stage, before they've even acquired enough syntactic competence to express their ideas. He talks about how people who are asked to speak before they're ready are going to fall back on the syntactic rules of their first language while speaking the second language. This is essentially just a fancy way to explain what I said earlier about building an intuitive mental model rather than trying to build sentences like a math problem in your head. The length of a silent period is honestly up to you, but I would recommend at least 6 months and ideally more like 1 or 1.5 years. More than that is probably unnecessary unless you don't feel any real compelling reason to start, which is fine too, but there are diminishing returns the longer you wait. Waiting anything above 2 years, assuming you're getting lots of input in that time, is probably not going to be that helpful. So let's talk more concretely about the benefits of a silent period. If you're trying to set yourself up for long-term success as a beginner, spending lots of time and effort trying to improve your speaking ability when you can't even understand most of the things that people are saying to you is just not an efficient use of time. When you haven't acquired a decent fundamental understanding of how Japanese actually works and sounds yet, trying to speak is just going to result in forcing yourself to build unnatural sentences with the limited vocabulary and grammar that you do know, which at best is unproductive and at worst can give you lasting habits that are going to be hard to get rid of later. Now, just to be clear, unless you're spending a significant amount of time speaking broken Japanese and getting very little exposure to actual natural speech, you're probably not going to be plagued with unbreakable bad habits. Spending a lot of time speaking when you don't really know how Japanese is supposed to sound can and will reinforce parts of your speech that sound foreign, so it's better just to avoid this entirely, but by getting input, you're going to slowly improve your understanding of the language and self-correct many of those mistakes. If you are taking an approach where you're going to be speaking early, it's really important to be consciously aware that what you're saying might not be correct, and to avoid repeatedly using phrases or words which you're not sure if they're natural or not. Honestly, if you're still a beginner or even an intermediate learner, it's still going to be the best use of your time to focus mostly on making actually understanding Japanese feel like second nature before you start trying to produce things for yourself. A lot of people think that in order to speak a language, you just need to remember a bunch of vocab and then use grammar to put it all together, but this is a huge oversimplification. I mentioned previously the idea that you're going to want to avoid treating speaking as if you're solving a math problem in your head, but what does this really mean? Well, just knowing grammar rules and vocab doesn't mean you're going to know how to say something in the same way that a native would say it. Some things in a language are going to completely disregard grammar rules or be said in a completely different way than you would have said them in your native language, and there isn't really any way to become aware of these things without just knowing them up front. Matt vs. Japan uses a phrase that I really like, which says, language is highly specific in unpredictable ways, which I think is a really good way to put this idea. Take the phrase, tie my shoes in English. Natives say this in almost exactly the same way every time, despite English having other words which could technically be used to represent the same idea. You could say something like tie my shoelaces or fasten my shoelaces, but for whatever reason, English speakers just say tie my shoes 99% of the time, and there's not really a reason for it, it's just like that. This is the same in Japanese. Japanese speakers almost exclusively use the phrase kutsuhimo o musubu, even though there are other words which could technically mean to tie something. You could take the English phrase tie my shoes, directly translating it, but the result's gonna sound kind of strange, even if they understand what you're saying. In Japanese, they specifically say tying shoelaces, not shoes, and the chance that you just pick the wrong verb for tying is pretty high. So if you don't know that this is said the exact same way every time, then you're probably gonna say something that sounds pretty unnatural. When you consider that this same thing happens for thousands of different words throughout every corner of the language, it's pretty evident that in order to output naturally, you're just gonna need to expose yourself to so much Japanese that you automatically know how most ideas are conveyed. Now, some people might be thinking, wait a second, if you speak a lot, won't natives correct your mistakes and you can just learn the right way through that? Something I think is really important to know is that even if your language exchange partners or friends want to help you improve, as long as what you're saying is understood, native speakers aren't going to go out of their way to correct you, even if it's not the same thing they would have said. You might get corrected sometimes, but corrections aren't a reliable mechanism for figuring out the correct way to say something that you're unsure is even wrong, especially if you're so new that everything you say probably has at least one mistake somewhere. If you're having a real, authentic interaction with a native, they're not going to stop the flow of conversation just to point out that you said tie my shoes in a weird way, because they understood what you meant and it would be inconvenient to stop and point it out. The point is, you can't rely on native speakers to reliably just tell you everything you're doing wrong. You kind of have to figure it out for yourself. This doesn't mean they can't help you or tell you what's right sometimes if you ask, but you can't really just rely on them to point out every single mistake you make and then use that as the sole mechanism for improvement. Okay, so next let's talk about pronunciation and accent. Every language has what's called a phonetic inventory, which is essentially just a group of sounds that make up the phonemes of that language. If your native language is English, then you were born with the English phonetic inventory, which is going to be different from other phonetic inventories like Japanese. Have you ever wondered why native Japanese speakers struggle with the sounds L and R? Well, it's because these sounds are not found in the phonetic inventory of the Japanese language, and they're actually pretty similar sounds despite not seeming like it at first. Unless they've gone out of their way to train themselves to hear the difference between L and R, native Japanese speakers are unable to even perceive a difference between these two sounds. Something like lock and rock are going to sound the exact same to them.
My ear is stupid and I can't pronounce a bottle of water. I can't correctly pronounce this phrase, and I think the reason why I can't pronounce is my ear is stupid. My ear cannot distinguish between native speakers a bottle of water and my a bottle of water.
Well, this same sort of thing happens for English speakers learning Japanese as well. You probably weren't even aware that this sound in Japanese is actually different from F in English, and that Japanese speakers don't actually push their teeth against their lips to make this sound like English speakers do to produce F. There are sounds that exist in Japanese which don't exist in English, and if you haven't trained yourself to distinguish between these sounds and the ones that are similar in your native language, you're probably going to be misinterpreting them, and you might not even be aware that you're doing so.
Fa. Fa.
Luckily for English speakers learning Japanese, the consonants and vowels of Japanese are not too different from the ones used in English, so you're never really going to have an issue being understood if you say something like oo instead of oot. But if you want to pronounce words in the same way that natives do, you're going to need to become able to differentiate these sounds. So does this mean that you have to go study phonetics and figure out what the difference is between a voiceless bilabial fricative and a voiceless labiodental fricative is? Well, you can if you want, but really all you got to do is expose your brain to so much Japanese that it automatically picks up these distinctions, so much to the point that you can hear Japanese in a similar way to how native speakers do. If you're able to build up this native-like understanding of how the language sounds, then you're automatically going to sound way better than most people when you start to output, because you're not just going to say something that you know is wrong. Once you get satisfied with your mental perception of Japanese, then you're going to want to start speaking. Like I said earlier, if you do this the other way around, which is what happens when you start speaking without having a solid understanding of the sounds, rhythm, and cadence of Japanese, you're going to sound very foreign. which again, if it lines up with your goals, is perfectly fine. So I talked about how input is the mechanism for which you're going to build your mental model of Japanese, but there's a slight caveat to this. If you're a native English speaker, Japanese consonants and vowels are not actually that difficult to get the hang of if you just spend a lot of time listening to Japanese. That being said, I do notice that some people struggle with the actual sounds themselves, and if that's the case, then you might want to spend some time doing some dedicated practice. Dogen has some pretty good resources on his channel that I would recommend if you're interested. I'll leave those in the description. So despite the phonemes of Japanese being pretty decently easy to pick up if you just expose yourself enough, there's a part of Japanese that people rarely get right, which I think is worth mentioning here. Pitch accent. I already know that by mentioning the fabled words, there are already people angrily typing in the comments talking about how learning pitch accent is pointless and how you shouldn't spend your time studying it, etc. And if you have that opinion, that's fine. I'm not here to tell you what to think. But if your goal is to sound similar to a native, you're going to want to at least be somewhat familiar with pitch accent. I'm going to make a dedicated video about this sometime soon, but for the time being, what is pitch accent? Okay, so to help explain this, let's look at English. English has what's called stress accent, which means that there's a single point in every single word which is produced longer and louder than the rest. Think about words like conflict and conflict. They're actually the same word, except if you stress it in a certain way, then it changes the meaning. Japanese has this too, but rather than using length and loudness to accent words, it uses pitch changes. For example, the word sento means bathhouse and the word sento means battle, despite having the exact same kana. If you're at the bathhouse and you say sento ni hairu, you're going to be understood, but you're technically saying it wrong. If you get the pitch accent wrong when you're speaking, it's going to sound like the English equivalent of saying something like, "Yesterday I studied Japanese in the library." Even if you never learn anything about pitch accent and are constantly saying words incorrectly, you're still going to be understood. There have been a few times where I've been misunderstood because I said something with the wrong pitch, but this isn't really common and I don't think you should worry about it too much. Unless you already natively speak a tonal language, picking up pitch changes is actually really difficult if you haven't trained yourself to do it. I know people who have listened to hundreds or even thousands of hours of Japanese and still can't hear pitch accent very well because they never bothered putting any attention into it. It's not one of those things that you're just going to pick up super easily without training yourself to hear it or paying any attention to it. So you're going to want to put in some conscious effort up front in order to allow yourself to pick it up naturally through input. You can do this in multiple ways, but I'd recommend going to the website kotsu.io, link in the description, and using the pitch accent minimal pairs test for 10 to 20 minutes every day until you can reliably get 100%. It's basically just a feedback loop where you listen to the audio and then select where you think the downstep is, and then you're going to get better over time by doing this.
新車紙片ガラガラ組む合詞
Once you can reliably hear the difference between pitch accents, then you don't really have to do anything else. Just try to keep it in the back of your mind when you're listening to Japanese, and they're going to start sticking out to you like a sore thumb. Also, pitch perception isn't something that you can just do in a few days or weeks. It's going to take some time to really get comfortable with it, so I'd recommend just taking it slow and not worrying about it too much. Just keep paying attention. When you start speaking Japanese, if you've spent a lot of time listening to natural speech and paying attention to how words sound pitch-wise, you're going to intuitively start saying them correctly. Pitch accent is one of those things where I think the 80-20 rule really comes into play. If you do 20% of the work, you're going to get 80% of the benefit, and your pronunciation is going to get miles better, even if you don't really care to put in the remaining effort. Okay, so something else I want to mention is that if you specifically care about your accent, it's probably a good idea to avoid doing extensive reading until you feel comfortable with understanding how Japanese actually sounds. I touched on this in my first video about immersion learning, but the reason for this is that when you read, you're actively sub-vocalizing in your head, which is essentially just the same as mentally outputting, and if you still don't have a strong understanding of the rhythm or cadence of Japanese, you're gonna start reinforcing your lack of awareness. This doesn't mean I'm saying you need to be neurotic about it and avoid the written language at all costs. I'm just saying that you probably shouldn't go out of your way to sit down and read a book until you feel like your listening ability is at a pretty strong level. Honestly, unless reading is your main way of studying, I don't think this is going to be a huge issue for you, but I figured it's important to mention anyways. Alright, so now that I've spent all of this time yapping about all of this theoretical stuff, let's assume that you've taken your silent period, you're now comfortable with how Japanese actually sounds, and you've spent hundreds or thousands of hours listening to Japanese. Now what? Now it's time to actually start practicing, which is the hard part. And the fun part. So like I've said 9,000 times in this video, if you've been getting a lot of input in building up your mental model of Japanese, you're going to have a pretty good understanding of how the language is supposed to sound when produced correctly. So does this mean that you're going to start speaking to natives, sound super fluent, and everything's going to be perfect? Absolutely not. Since you already have a really strong foundation in input, you're going to sound miles better than your average textbook learner who hasn't spent a lot of time with authentic material, but you're still probably going to be devastated by how bad you actually sound when you start speaking. The whole point of focusing heavily on input and taking a silent period is that you build up awareness, and the fact that you have enough awareness to understand how much you actually suck is such a huge strength. If you've ever heard someone speak their target language and you don't know that language, then you probably think, wow, they sound so fluent, they sound so good. Yet, if a native speaker heard them, then they might think, oh, that person has a really thick accent. You can't perceive someone's mistakes, including your own, if your ability to perceive the physical sounds isn't built up really high. So the ability to actually hear how bad you really are is critical if you want to go back and fix those mistakes. Okay, so what should you be doing to practice? Well, you can honestly do a lot of things. The main thing you want to focus on is imitation. Constantly be thinking, how would a Japanese person express this idea? Which, if you have a strong foundation in input, should come pretty naturally to you. Also, it might be obvious, but if you're in the months leading up to beginning speaking, you're probably going to want to spend a lot of time specifically listening to people who sound similar to how you want to sound. Japanese speakers talk differently depending on things such as age, gender, personality, etc. So if you want to come off in a certain way, then you should talk a certain way. The best way to do this is just to spend a lot of time listening to people in the demographic that you want to sound like. Like, if you're a dude in your 20s, you probably don't want to spend the majority of your time listening to Oba-chan's talk because, you know. Actually, scratch that. I think that's a great idea. It's the same thing if you're studying a dialect, and probably even more important in that case. If you're studying Kansai-ben, for example, you're going to want to spend a lot of time listening to Kansai-ben. Now, you don't need to be neurotic about this and only listen to people who talk how you want to speak, but you definitely want a lot of your exposure to be coming from people who sound like how you want to sound like. Okay, so you want to start speaking Japanese. What should you do right now? When I first started getting into output, one of the first things that I started doing was a lot of written output. The benefit of this is that you're not under a time constraint like you are in a conversation, and you have more time to process if what you're actually saying is correct or not. If you don't know a certain word, then you can just look it up in the dictionary on the spot. You can't do that in a conversation. If you're taking a listening dominant approach and purposefully not doing extensive reading, as was the case for me, then this can also help you start becoming familiar with words which you might know very well through the spoken language, but maybe haven't learned how they're written yet. Something I would highly recommend doing is starting some sort of daily writing exercise where you just sit down for a while and just ramble about whatever you want on a text document or something. You don't have to worry about making your writing sound perfect or flawless, but if you're completely lost and feel like nothing wants to come out, then you might want to consider taking another few months to continue getting input and then come back to this later. I personally spent a lot of time on language exchange apps, messaging people, texting online or Discord, and doing that every day helps me improve my writing really quickly. As for actually speaking to people, there are two ways which I would recommend going about this. First, if you have the means to, you can use a service like italki, who sponsored this video, to meet with a tutor and start having speaking practice sessions. I know they literally paid me to promote them, but I genuinely think that if you have the means to, using a service like this just to have a reliable person to talk to is a good idea. You shouldn't go out of your way to have them teach you the language, but just having someone who can give you feedback and offer real-time interactions to what you say is really valuable. The other way that I really think is a good way to start speaking, and this is mostly what I did, is using VRChat. VRChat is basically just a free game you can get on Steam where you join random worlds and talk to people, and it's super useful for practicing languages. It's made for the purpose of just hanging out with people in VR, but you don't need a VR headset to play. It works fine on a regular computer. If you go to the world section and type JP, you're going to see a list of worlds made for Japanese speakers, which is where you can find people to talk to. I'll put some recommended worlds on screen. Specifically, if you're just starting to output and want to talk with people who are open to talking to foreigners, I'd recommend the ENJP Exchange World, and this is where you'll find other Japanese learners and Japanese people who are learning English. I go in there pretty frequently, so you might actually find me in there if you go. VRChat was actually my main source of output for a long time, and I made a lot of friends there who I still talk to, so I definitely recommend trying it if you're looking to make Japanese friends and practice speaking in a natural setting. Something else that gets recommended a lot is called shadowing, which involves playing an audio clip and trying to replicate it out loud in real time.
シチュエーションに合わせてそういういろんな日本語を使い分けることができるかっていうのが自然な日本語になるんじゃないかなって思うんです。
This can help you notice when your pronunciation is different from how a native speaker would have said it, and mostly I think it just gets you physically speaking Japanese without the pressure of having someone hear you or having to respond in real time. You can also record yourself speaking or shadowing, and if your understanding of Japanese is at a high enough level, then you're going to notice most of your mistakes and you can start working on fixing them. I never really did much shadowing personally, so I can't really vouch for its effectiveness firsthand, but I've talked to a lot of people who found it helpful, so if you think that it's going to be worth it for you, then I would definitely try it. Okay, so something else I want to mention is that just because you've started outputting doesn't mean that you should stop getting a large amount of input every day. A cool thing about output is that it primes your brain to notice things that you might not have picked up on before. For example, if there's an idea you're trying to express in Japanese, but you don't know how a Japanese speaker would phrase it, when you return to your immersion, you're going to start noticing how Japanese speakers express that idea. If you're struggling with a certain phrase, when you do hear it in your immersion, you're more likely to have an aha moment, and then it's going to be easier for you to remember next time you want to say it. The interaction between input and output plays a huge role in learning to speak, so it's crucial that you keep immersing yourself in the language, even if your main goal is to improve your speaking ability. By continuing to practice speaking and then immersing yourself in natural Japanese, you're creating a really efficient feedback loop for yourself that's going to allow you to make really steady progress. Finally, I want to talk about consistency and pushing your cutting edge forward. Something I've noticed since starting output is that there's going to be days in which you feel super fluent and amazing, and then there are going to be days which you feel like you don't even know the language at all. Even now, some days I feel like, damn, I'm so fluent, I'm basically Japanese, and some days I feel like I can't even string together a single sentence. This becomes less and less of a problem the more experience you get in speaking, but even to this day, consistency is still something I'm working on, and I don't really think it's ever something that you're going to stop trying to get better at. I noticed that there's a pretty strong correlation between how well I can output and how much time I had spent doing things in Japanese during that day or that week. Honestly, the most fluent in Japanese that I'd ever felt were the times where I was constantly speaking Japanese for 12 plus hours straight when I was in Japan. If you're still getting the feel for output and just testing the waters, it's fine to treat it as a side thing for a while, but at some point, if you're serious about actually pushing to the next level, you're going to want to start treating it less of something that you practice and more like something that you just do because it's part of your life. I would say that a lot of my success learning Japanese has come from just building connections with people as friends, then talking to them normally in the same way that I would with my English-speaking friends, except now I'm just using Japanese. It's important to have moments when using Japanese feels so normal to you that you forget you're even speaking a foreign language. And the easiest way to get to this point is just to forget about trying to learn Japanese and start using it as a tool to communicate with normal people. If you start using Japanese as a tool for interacting with people in your life without the specific goal of learning Japanese, it's gonna start feeling like second nature to you and you're gonna forget that you're even speaking a foreign language. Now you might be thinking, what, you're telling me I need to move to Japan? Which would definitely help, but you can just as easily find Japanese people through the internet as you can in Japan anyways, so it's not really that difficult to do if you go out of your way to find people. Also, just because I'm saying that you should use Japanese as a tool doesn't mean that I'm saying you should stop trying to mimic natives or stop trying to improve your own speech. I'm just saying that it would help to have some actual purpose behind using Japanese rather than just using it for the sake of getting your daily speaking practice in. One thing I want to emphasize is that if you're meeting people organically, whether it's online or in real life, even if your main goal is to practice your Japanese, you don't want to treat them as teachers by bombarding them with language questions or by asking them to correct your every mistake. It's fine to ask questions occasionally, but it's more important to build actual friendships rather than viewing people as language learning resources. Okay, so if you actually watched all of this, then you have my greatest gratitude. Thank you. I didn't actually plan on making this a half-hour long, but here we are. Even though I just spent forever diving into the complexities of min-maxing output ability, I don't want you to come away from this video thinking that you have to do or have to have done everything exactly the way that I described here. The main takeaway that I want this video to have is that you're not going to learn Japanese by speaking, but rather that you learn to speak by building up a mental framework in your head, then catching your speaking ability up to that mental framework. Rather than drip feeding yourself speaking practice limited by comprehension ability and potentially fossilizing your errors, it's going to be better just to focus on building up to a certain level of competence first, then quickly catching up your speaking ability when you've actually got a decent grasp of how the language is supposed to work. To what extent you actually want to take this advice to is honestly personal preference, so just do whatever you feel like is going to work for you. Anyways, I usually don't care to ask this, but I put a lot of time in this video, more time than I'd care to admit, so if you found anything helpful, then a like would really be appreciated. Okay, see you guys later.